Well, hello to all of my methodical researchers out there. Today we are going to discuss everyone's favorite topic, which has me trembling with excitement, the rulemaking process, with a bit of important related material about regulatory publication at the end. So, in our last video, we tried to define and describe administrative law with the purpose of giving us the proper conceptual framework for researching that administrative law. In particular, we discussed how legislatures delegate some of their lawmaking power to agencies, who then use that power to promulgate regulations, a type of codified law. And we also mentioned that grant of power, that delegation of legislative authority, has certain limitations. One key limitation is what they call the rulemaking process, and that is today's topic. It is important to understand this process because it's going to underlie nearly all of the regulations that you're going to encounter in your research. That rulemaking process is a requirement of the Administrative Procedures Act, or the APA. This is the statute that establishes the general framework for federal administrative law. In addition, every state is also going to have a similar statute that sets up the framework for their administrative law as well. In Georgia, it's called, wait for it, the Georgia Administrative Procedure Act. Now, this rulemaking process that the APA requires is designed to ensure that agencies undertake an orderly process and they consider evidence and different viewpoints and different stakeholders when they promulgate regulations. If agencies don't abide by this required rulemaking process, their rules can be challenged in court and declared invalid, and that happens all the time. Now, there are, of course, some categories of regulations for which this rulemaking process that we're going to describe might not be required, but that's really another topic entirely, where you'll have to take that admin law course later on in law school to get more of the specifics. So our first step here in the rulemaking process is critical, but fortunately, it is quite easy to understand. Before an agency can exercise rulemaking authority, the authority to promulgate regulations, Congress must enact a statute that grants that agency rulemaking authority. That makes sense, doesn't it? We refer to this statute as an enabling statute. It enables the agency to make these regulations. And that is a really important term to remember, enabling statute. The enabling statute is going to contain text that describes the nature of that delegation of authority. These will often be styled as a delegation that is specific to the head of the agency, but of course, much of the actual rulemaking is just going to occur naturally further down the chain of command at the agency. The scope of that delegation that you find in the enabling statute can really vary quite a bit. Sometimes an agency will have very broad authority to promulgate regulations, while at other times its ability to engage in rulemaking will be much more constrained, much narrower. And often the delegation will actually require the agency to make rules on a certain topic or issue, and that, of course, is going to take some of the agency's discretion away. On occasion, the enabling statute may also spell out other requirements that the agency must meet in order to engage in rulemaking. Now, the enabling statute, it's also commonly going to be our easiest entryway into researching regulations, and that's another key reason that it's really important. But we'll talk more about that and the way it works in a later video. Now, between that first step and the second step, there is a whole lot of action. Usually, This is going to entail agencies gathering information and studying in depth whatever problem the proposed regulation is intended to solve. And when they've completed this process and they've gathered information, they've researched the problem, the agency will hunker down and propose a rule or regulation. This proposed rule must then be published in the Federal Register, a publication that's important for administrative law that we're going to discuss in more detail just a little bit later. And this idea of giving notice is really a key part of this entire rulemaking process. Indeed, you'll often hear people refer to this rulemaking process simply as notice and comment. This is exactly what they're talking about when they say that. Now, this publication that gives notice in the Federal Register is called a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or an NPRM. It's going to include key information such as the statutory authority for the rule or the enabling statute, the substance of the issues that are under consideration by the agency, any findings of the agency in preparing the proposed rules, and any important deadlines for participation in the rulemaking process. Most of this information is actually going to be really helpful for us later when we're trying to interpret a regulation. Unlike a legislature, agencies are generally at least going to try to tell us why they enacted a regulation and how they expect to apply or enforce it. So if that step was all about notice, this next step is all about comments. And this is key because public participation by interested parties is considered to be the foundation of this rulemaking process. Usually, the agency is going to conduct hearings where stakeholders and interested parties can testify and ask questions about the proposed rule. The agency will also invite comments from the general public on the proposed rule. And if you wanted to engage in this participation process, you would use the regulations.gov portal to make comments on the rules. I have done some of this commenting on proposed rules on environmental regulations in my own legal experience, and it can really be quite interesting. The comments are going to vary tremendously, from short comments from interested members of the public to very detailed and expansive commentary and feedback from important stakeholders, advocacy groups, and the like. Generally, an NPRM is going to be open to comments for at least 60 days, with an additional 30 days included for reply comments. Now, before we can reach the next major step of the rulemaking process, the agency must respond to those comments. This might involve explaining the agency's rationale or addressing various concerns from interested parties. It also might even involve changing the text of the rule, and depending on the significance of such a change, the agency might even be forced to initiate a new rulemaking process due to these changes. But assuming that isn't the case, we'll reach the next major step. The final rule will be published in the Federal Register, just like the NPRM was. This final rule will include a lot of the same information that we saw in the NPRM as well, such as the agency's findings, the rationale behind the regulation, and the source of statutory authority, the enabling statute. It will usually also include the agency's responses to the most important substantive comments that it received during that previous step of the process where the public was invited to comment on the proposed rule. And this step is really the end of the rulemaking process as such. Generally, there does need to be at least 30 days between the publication of that final rule and when the final rule takes effect. In addition to that, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, an executive branch agency, is going to review all significant agency regulations before they're allowed to take effect, which can include additional delays. This review generally involves conducting a sort of cost-benefit analysis. Now, finally, our final step, The final rule is going to be codified in a publication called the Code of Federal Regulations, which we usually just refer to as the CFR. The CFR is analogous to the statutory code, but it's for federal regulations. It's going to organize regulations by subject, which is going to make them much easier for us to research and understand. However, it's not going to include that explanatory information that we saw, such as the agency's findings and the reason for the rule, so it can still be quite helpful to look up that version from the Federal Register. Now, of course, this is really a somewhat simplified representation of the rulemaking process under the APA. It is helpful for you to be familiar with it because you may be participating in it as a stakeholder or an interested party. It's also helpful when you are trying to interpret a regulation, since the agency is usually going to be quite explicit about the purpose of the regulation and about how they expect it to apply. And of course, the states are all going to have processes that are roughly analogous to this rulemaking process under their versions of the Administrative Procedures Act, such as the Georgia Administrative Procedures Act here in Georgia. Okay, let's move on to the closely related topic of regulatory publication. This is really going to help you better grasp how you'll actually use your new knowledge of the rulemaking process when you're doing this research into regulations. So where do we find these materials that are produced in the rulemaking process? We've alluded to some of these sources throughout our discussion of that process, but it's going to hinge around two key sources, two key publications: the Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR. And most of your regulations are going to be published in the Federal Register first, so we're going to discuss that source first. The Federal Register is published every day. It is in chronological order. And this makes it invaluable for getting that context, that history and background of the regulations that we research. But it is a double-edged sword. This chronological order is also going to make it quite challenging for us to use. Many of your key rulemaking materials, your NPRMs, your final rules in particular, are required to be published in the Federal Register. And you're also going to find some information in the Federal Register that you're just not going to be able to find in the version of the rule that you would use in the CFR. This includes information about the purpose of the regulation, as well as information about like the agency's findings and different things, like as we discussed in passing when we were discussing that rulemaking process. Now, in addition to these straight up regulatory materials, these artifacts of the rulemaking process, you're also going to find a wide variety of miscellaneous documents in the Federal Register. This is going to include executive materials like executive orders, things like that, different presidential statements. And it's also going to include a really key finding tool, an updating tool for regulatory research called the Parts Affected. And this basically, it tells us all of the different sections of the CFR that were amended by the different regulations that were promulgated for any given volume of the Federal Register. And that way we can quickly see what parts of the code are going to be amended and changed by the volume of the Federal Register that we're looking at. And that makes it much easier to update the regulations that we're researching. And we'll talk more about how to do that, how to use that. But for now, you just need to know that this is going to be included in the Federal Register. Federal Register is going to be easy for you to find in your research. It's located in the usual suspects: Westlaw, Letsis, Hein Online, and you can also find a free version at govinfo.gov. All right, let's talk about this process of codification. The Office of the Federal Register is going to take all of the final rules that were published in the Federal Register and it's going to organize them by subject. This makes it much easier for us to research regulations, as I alluded to earlier. And if you want to think about it this way, make an analogy to statutes, your Federal Register is going to be somewhat analogous to the session laws that you would find in the statutes at large when you're doing statutory research. And to extend that analogy, the Code of Federal Regulations is going to be analogous to the U.S. Code that we all know and love. It's going to be organized by subject into 50 different titles. Now, unlike the Federal Register, the CFR is almost entirely regulations, with the minor exception of Title III, where you can find some various executive material such as EOs. And the official CFR is published on a staggered quarterly schedule. Titles 1 through 16 are updated on January 1st, Titles 17 through 27 updated on April 1st, and so on and so forth for the additional titles each quarter. Now, often you're going to be using a continually updated version of the CFR, such as the free eCFR or the Westlaw or Letsis versions. But if the regulation is not yet officially published in the official version of the CFR according to that quarterly update schedule, best practices is going to dictate that you reflect the fact that it's not officially published in your citation and point readers to the publication in the Federal Register. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that works in a later video. Now, it's really useful that the subject organization that we find in the Code of Federal Regulations is going to mirror that of the U.S. Code. And because the chapters and the parts of the CFR tend to be based on different statutes that you'll find in the U.S. Code, this often aids our research tremendously. And you should know that you'll often find the same agency in different titles. So the Department of Transportation, they have regulations in aeronautics and space, which is Title 14, as well as Title 33, navigation/navigable waters, and of course, Title 49, the transportation title, the one that you would immediately expect. So it's not a one agency per title type organization. So yeah, that is the rulemaking process, along with some related materials on regulatory publication. Now, it's not especially important that you know every single little detail of that process, but you do need to be familiar with its broad outlines and its core concepts, and, of course, with the sources that are associated with those different steps of the process and how you'll use them when you're doing research. Now, in our next video, we're going to look at how you will use your knowledge to actually find regulations in your research. Okay, that's all I have for now. Until next time.